Well, it is time for us to plant some of our squash. For those of you who have followed along with us, you know that going back to some of our sort of previous videos this year and even last year, squash is a big producer for us, both summer squash and winter squash. And today I'm only planting summer squash because we're not quite set up in our garden plans to be planting the winter squash. But I wanted to show you a few sort of considerations and just a little bit of a discussion, at least on what we're going to do this year for planting our yellow crookneck summer squash, which is an absolute favorite of ours. This area was actually used as a winter pen for some of our Icelandic sheep during the breeding season. And you can see, for the most part, although we've got to add some over here, there's still a pretty good layer of basically straw / hay mulch over most of the garden. Now, one thing I will say, we do use a couple of different sort of gardening methods in our gardening efforts. So last year, this garden had a lot of potatoes in it, some of our Scotia tomatoes, and a couple of other things. So a very different assortment than what it's going to have this year. It was a brand new garden. We tilled it for the very first time, broke the sod up. It had never ever been a garden before. Definitely had some interesting finds. It was fairly rocky in places, but it did great for growing the potatoes. Now, one of the things we did was we mulched it very, very heavily. And what I show you in a minute really kind of does show the benefit of no-till method if you can do it. The male builds the nest, and if the female doesn't like it, she rips it apart. And he starts all over again. And it's quite the nest too, for those who aren't familiar with them. They're a woven hanging basket. Kind of the original basket weavers. All that color, all that singing, and all that building. So even though this is a squash video, this is our garlic patch. So we have two kinds of garlic. Some Siberian garlic, kind of right down here in this row, and the rest is music garlic. This was where the potatoes were, and you can still see the mulch. This was mulched very, very heavily, and the garlic is doing amazing, and I will show you why it's doing amazing. Here is one of the holes I've dug for one of our yellow crookneck squash plants. As you can see, it's still quite moist underneath. We've had a lot of rain recently, but we are at the moment quite hot, and the last few days it's been fairly dry. So you do get quite a bit of moisture retention, and as you kind of do see around, we still have quote-unquote weeds, but far, far fewer of them. Now, part of that I equate to the sheep having just decimated everything, and part of that is the mulch, in my opinion, at least in this garden. So what we're doing is we're digging these holes, and I had one. They've already left. When I flipped over the mulch layer, there was a ton of worms in it, but I did this a few minutes ago. So each one of these holes is getting a plant. We have 8 in total to go in, these summer squash. A very important thing about squash is you don't want to significantly bury that stem. So these are just about grade with the soil that's around them. These little guys should do well once I get them all in the ground. But here's the starts. So we've started 1 seed per tray, and we're not letting these get very large because, and I will try my best to show this here in a minute, when you pull them out, you will see there's already a substantial amount of root on them, and squash don't really like their roots disturbed much. So we've let these kind of dry for about a day so that the soil block is fairly solid, and we've basically just been popping these out and putting them right into the ground without disturbing that root mass. So here we go. We're going to show you what this looks like. I've got a squash seedling. Just going to put our hand over the pot. These are nice pots because they're quite small. You can already see the roots coming to the bottom. They pop out quite nice. And there's our block, and there's all of our roots. You can see pretty well. So although for some plants you might want to ruck this up a little bit, when it comes to squash, you're just going to plop it in the hole as is. So through the miracle of modern cinematography, we've gone to another squash hole with another squash plant. And again, you can see all the roots that have formed on these very small plants. And I kind of put that in fairly gently. And then I'm just going to backfill around it. You can see in this no-till method, you do have quite a few worms right up at the surface. And those are not the red wigglers, those are the big, what everybody calls earthworms. But just packing it in a little bit. And what I'm going to do is come back and water these very, very generously, because obviously squash loves water, and these will be a little bit potentially stressed going from the greenhouse to here, because they'll be exposed to a little bit more intensity of sunlight, but they should do quite well. So one more to go, and then we water. Well, all 8 of our yellow crookneck squash are planted, and you can barely see them there amongst the mulch, but that will definitely give them a head start after being transplanted out. We'll obviously keep watering these sort of as needed, at least for the first little bit, until they get a bit more established and get some roots down into the more moist soil that's below them. So as a complete aside to the planting of the squash, I just realized that for the most part this has become a very yellow garden space. We have our white Thomasville tomatoes, which are a pale yellow variety of a tomato. We have our pineapple tomatoes, which are another yellow tomato. I'm going to be planting some of our black mammoth sunflowers, which of course sunflowers, they're yellow. And we have a yellow dry bean that we are planting as well in here, and then we have the yellow crookneck squash. So the only thing right now, the only things that are in this garden space that aren't actually yellow are our garlic and our black Hungarian peppers, which were planted out last week. So watch this space and see how yellow this garden gets as our yellow crookneck squash and everything else in here grows over the summer.